Okay. I think we can get started. So welcome to everybody. First of all, I would like to thank you for joining us today as we kick off the first session of our seminar, Deanthrocentric Materialism and the Politics of Matter, itself part of a wider project entitled Humanities After Humans. The first session is called Matter and Industry, and it will confront the study of material culture and artworks, and more specifically of matter and substances as global resources to the paradigms of eco-critical thinking. So before we start, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. As usual, we are planning to have two Q&A sessions at the end of the keynote and at the end of the panel. You can write your questions directly in the chat and we'll ask them for you. Or you can simply raise your hand at the end to ask a question yourself. Diane and Estelle will be monitoring this and help me through this. So we're delighted to have three wonderful speakers today with a range of talks on subjects such as the color of the Anthropocene, underwater objects, or petrocapitalism. It's great to have you for this event. As I said, today's talks are part of a multi-part series of conferences. The idea for this seminar really arises from the general theme of our conference, that is, the place of humanities in the deconstruction of anthropocentrism, or to phrase it differently, the place of humanities when it comes to the decentering of humans. As we move away from dualist forms of thinking that see humans as rational beings with a hold on matter, we stop considering artifacts and things as simply responding to the desires of their creators. That is, we stop thinking that human beings are minds on legs with an all-encompassing hold on matter. The philosophical question that has, this philosophical question that has existed ever since Aristotle could give us the impression that by pushing aside human subjectivity, we are pushing aside the politics of the objects under study. But paradoxically, this way of promoting material thinking stems from reflections that are eminently political. By decentering human beings, we actually question what we define as human, or what we put behind the term anthropos. So through this series, we really wanted to explore this tension. We really wanted to think about the ways in which this tension holds together. And I'm not going to expand on this for much longer, but if you want to know more about our intentions with this seminar, I invite you to check our blog, Humanities After Humans. So this session will run till 5 p.m. and it will be recorded and uploaded on YouTube for 1 month. I'm going to introduce our first speaker and keynote, Kirsty Sinclair at Dootson. So Kirsty is a lecturer in film studies at the University of St. Andrews, but is currently a research fellow in art history at Newham College, Cambridge University. Her work broadly interrogates links between materials, technologies, aesthetics, and ideologies. And her work has been published in Screen, Film History, and British Art Studies. She's currently completing a book on chromatic technologies in modern Britain, and she's co-editing a collection on the material and technical history of film stock. Kirsty, I would like to invite you to share your screen.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay. Now.
We tested it. Normally, it should work.
Sorry, this is not getting us off to a great start, is it?
Should I?
No, that's...
Yep.
That is okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. You'd think after weeks of online teaching I'd have mastered this by now. Okay, is that opening slide? Great. Okay. So thank you, Sarah. I wanted to start by extending my enormous gratitude to Sarah and the INHA for inviting me to speak today. The Politics of Matter, the title of today's proceedings, is a subject fundamental to my research, and I'm delighted and honoured to be asked to open this exciting event, exploring in Sarah's terms how matter matters. As a scholar working between the disciplines of film studies and art history, I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other speakers whose scholarship similarly crosses disciplinary boundaries and interrogates these links between materiality, making, and meaning. So thank you again for this kind invitation. I'm particularly grateful to be invited to speak about the question of Deanthrocentric materialism, because it's forced me to reconsider the terms and framework of my own research. As Sarah mentioned, I'm currently completing a book provisionally titled Chromotechnics. I'm just gonna, there we go. Provisionally titled Chromotechnics, about the material and technical history of colour in modern Britain, which considers how changes to the ways that colours were made radically transformed their meanings. The project thinks very intently about the politics of materiality, considering how the material production of colour in the form of paints, inks and dyes, as well as the new kinds of labour and techniques necessitated by chromatic mass media, namely printing, photography, film and television, made colour a crucial site where the experience of modernity in Britain was forged. Beginning with industrially produced synthetic textile dyes in the 1850s and ending with the emergence of colour television in the 1960s, I've been thinking about how the messy materiality and technical specificity required by these new modes of making colour made them a critical location for articulating the wider social and political changes that shaped modern Britain. Changes to labour wrought by industrial capitalism, the new social and professional status of women following World War I, the decline and collapse of the British Empire at the mid-century, and the shifting racial makeup of Britain following decolonisation in the post-war period. The material turn, which reinvigorated technical art history with a new social, political conscience, a way of thinking together processes of making and meaning, has therefore been vital to my work. But the invitation to de-center the human from my thinking, to approach a de-anthrocentric materialism, has made me revisit the material I explore in my book from a new critical perspective. If the contention of my book is that the meaning of colour is profoundly bound up in its making, then the invitation to speak today has encouraged me to ask what other meanings colour could produce beyond those relevant to social and cultural history. What meanings, for instance, might colour produce for natural history? I chose to speak about colour and the Anthropocene today as, although periodizations and definitions of the Anthropocene remain issues of contention, it's agreed that this new geological era demonstrates that human and non-human history are now entirely inseparable, that cultural and natural history have become permanently intertwined. As Jennifer Peterson and Greg Ullin suggest in their consideration of cinema and the Anthropocene, this new time period highlights what they call, and I quote, the parallels, patterns, and uncanny synchronicities between human action and ecological change. Broadly defined as a new period of geological time, which identifies the impact of the human as the most significant force altering the Earth's physical environment and its climate, the Anthropocene is understood as the cumulative product of farming, agriculture, and deforestation, the extractive economies of oil, gas, and coal. And that's the image you see here is an image of coal mining in Germany. And the emissions that these substances release into the atmosphere, the pollution and toxification of oceans and waterways, and a series of extinction events impacting flora, fauna, and not to mention human populations on a global scale. Perhaps ironically, given the prominence this label offers to the anthropos, the human, the Anthropocene is an ideal lens through which to interrogate, critique, and revise the centrality of the human. It is what Heather Davis and Etienne Turpin describe in their edited volume on art in the Anthropocene as a call to reimagine the human through biology and geology. If the Anthropocene insists upon the connectedness of human action and environmental impact, then colour, I suggest, operates as a crucial interface between these two realms. The material production of colour is contingent upon a human worldview that sees the earth in terms of resources, whether the plants, insects, and precious minerals ground up to make pigments, or the byproducts of the coal industry historically used as chemical components for synthesizing artificial hues. The long material history of colour, linked with global trade, is also enmeshed in the modes of colonial exploitation and extractive imperialism that have been linked to the Anthropocene through the so-called Orbis spike hypothesis, proposed in 2015 by ecologists Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin. A hypothesis that suggests human impact upon the climate can be directly traced to the European contact with, mercantile exploitation of, and colonial violence against the Americas and its peoples, which in Lewis and Maslin's terms, and I quote, allowed Europe to transcend its ecological limits. This moment they point to in the year 1610 witnessed the mass deaths of so many indigenous peoples that the period saw a major dip in carbon emissions, a place where human intervention in the form of racialized violence first makes its mark on the geological record. Such a hypothesis also points to the insolubility of racial and climate justice, which has led many to critique the generalizing terminology of the Anthropocene, as though humankind as a singular homogeneous group was equally responsible for and affected by climate change, when in fact environmental devastation has largely been the product of white Western capitalism and disproportionately impacted people of colour in the global south. As Shreya Chatterjee noted in her recent piece in British Art Studies, and I quote, the Anthropocene is best viewed as a racial practice that has produced and continues to produce racially uneven vulnerability and death. She points to Francois Verger's term, the racial capitalocene, as one that highlights the absolute imbrication of race, capitalism, imperialism, and climate. In terms of thinking through colour's relationship to the Anthropocene, such discourses can help bring together the histories of colour as race and colour as material hue, whereby the European desire for colour in the form of tinctorial substances, whether cochineal or safflower, drove global trade, travel, and transactions, but also precipitated the use of enforced or enslaved labour, a practice which reached its peak at a time when European taxonomies of race became increasingly codified in terms of colour, which by the end of the 18th century were fixed into a palette of black, white, red, and yellow. A pigment like mummy brown, which you see here, offers a particularly acute example of these interconnected histories of colour, empire, violence, and racial hierarchies, whereby the bodies of embalmed Egyptians were destroyed and ground down in order to make pigments for a hue particularly popular with British painters in the 19th century. By asking what colour is the Anthropocene, I hope to highlight the impossibility of disarticulating the racialized, aesthetic, and ecological implications of the material production of dyes, tints, and pigments. I'm interested, moreover, in how colour, as an object of aesthetic pleasure, of visual charm, of optical and sensual seduction, perhaps masked and obscured, or maybe even glamorized and beautified its damaging ecological effects. And I think that the Tom Hagen photograph that I just showed is perhaps an example of that. When the Anthropocene is routinely presented in terms of decay, befoulment, erosion, contamination, devastation, pollution, and defilement, has colour perhaps become a cosmetic for the climate crisis? What follows then is a series of speculations about colour's relationship to and active participation in the Anthropocene. a way of reframing the history of colour as a history of climate. It marks a beginning for me of rethinking a familiar material and technical history through a new and less familiar critical lens. But rather than organise these thoughts strictly chronologically, instead I present them here in a manner more conventionally used for organising colours, a spectrum, beginning with indigo. If, as Lewis and Malin suggest, the Anthropocene begins in the 17th century with the rise of globalised modes of trade, then the colour of the Anthropocene is indigo. A highly desirable dye due to its permanence and stability, indigo is derived from a plant whose transformation into a dyestuff required an exacting and careful process. Its sap harvested at the precise moment of flowering before extended drying, subsequent soaking and agitation before further drying into cakes for sale. The image I show you here is a chromolithographic reproduction of a watercolour by British artist William Simpson titled An Indigo Factory in Bengal, reproduced in his 1867 publication, India, Ancient and Modern. The picturesque scene shows the various stages involved in the complex process of indigo dye manufacture, but naturalises them as part of the landscape. The factory itself is nestled in a picturesque location, framed with lush green vegetation on either side, and the dye vats almost look like extensions of the hillside itself, rendered in a similar shade of stony grey-brown. The factory is presented as embedded in the networks of nature. Animals pull carts to assist in the process, and a wheel draws water from the river to fill the vats. That the indigo vats produce a colour in the same blue-purple shades as the river indicates both that the water is fed back into the river after its use in the process, taking some indigo dye with it, but also that the colour of indigo produced is of the most authentically natural shade. It is the colour of water and of the sky. And just to note that I haven't come across any technical analysis of this image, but indigo itself was a popular watercolor pigment, so it's very possible that this image, the original watercolor, was itself painted with indigo. The scene is clearly idealized in numerous ways, not least as it makes no suggestion of the so-called Indigo Revolt occurring only 4 years earlier, in which Bengali workers rose up against British colonial forces, instrumental in overseeing these indigo operations. But indigenous practices of indigo harvesting did operate in Central and South America, North Africa, and across Asia since antiquity. But it was from the 17th century that indigo became vital to colonial interests in the Dutch East Indies, French West Indies, Spanish Central America, and subsequently British India. A labour-intensive crop which required the cultivation of 100 pounds of plant to produce a single pound of dye, or in other words, 2,000 square feet of land to produce a single cake of indigo. The demand for the crop radically reorganised, established and more sustainable patterns of agriculture. In Bengal, for instance, which you see in this chromolithograph, land dedicated to stable food crops was repurposed for intensive indigo farming, causing not only disruptions to the local ecosystems, but major food shortages and starvation among local inhabitants. As a highly labour-intensive crop to cultivate, indigo was rendered affordable to colonial traders through the use of enforced and enslaved labour. In the 17th and 18th centuries, South Asian textiles dyed with indigo, and sometimes indigo cakes themselves, were traded for enslaved peoples on the west coast of Africa, who were then forced to work cultivating indigo on plantations in the Caribbean and America, producing dyes to colour textiles sold back in Europe. Indigo was therefore a substance that lubricated the mass displacement of peoples, as well as the reorganisation of local ecologies, that has made the Anthropocene inseparable from colonial strategies of interference and violence. But I want to present another image here in contrast to Simpson's colonial gaze, a still from Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, which in 1991 became the first feature film directed by an African-American woman to be theatrically distributed across America. The film, which unfolds at the turn of 20th century America in the South Carolina Sea Islands, follows a family descended from enslaved Africans, forcibly brought to America to cultivate indigo. Scenes of indigo processing and its transformation into cakes bear witness to the matriarch Nana's recollections of her ancestors, their hands being, in her words, scarred with blue from the poisonous indigo dye. But the fact that the film's narrator, an unborn child representing a future generation of the family, also wears an indigo dyed ribbon in her hair, testifies to the longue durée of these chromatic interventions in natural and human history, that these forcible reorganizations of agricultural production and human labor have legacies from the past that extend far into the future. And Francois Vergès has highlighted how the Anthropocene forces us to reconsider the temporality of colonial violence as it plays out slowly through ecological change. If the Anthropocene is the product of what anthropologist Rosa E. Fisek calls human entanglements with cattle, then the colour of the Anthropocene is yellow, or more specifically Indian yellow or puree, a pigment produced from the purified urine of cows fed solely on mango leaves, which reached the height of its popularity in the 19th century. As Fisek argues, and I quote, "Cattle are creatures of the Anthropocene." From early agricultural practices that saw mass deforestation to the methane produced by the current global demand for meat and dairy, human interventions in the breeding, rearing, and consumption of cattle have been a key contributor to the climate crisis. Indeed, cattle are the most powerful example of what Nicole Shukin dubs animal capital, arguing, like Fisek, that cattle subtend capitalism, as the transformation of the crude, messy, organic life cycles of animals into the organizational structures of mass production and consumption helped establish a pattern for how human intervention into the organizational rhythms of nature could be exploited for financial ends, with cataclysmic effects for the release of greenhouse gases and the unsustainable use of farmland. In 2013, Finnish artist and writer Terike Hapuja and Laura Gustafsson staged an exhibition in which they imagined history told from the perspective of cattle, who described how they had been rendered objects by human capitalism. These fictive cow narrators described their current moment, and I quote, "Stuck in the industrial processes, we live in collective isolation, cut off from all relations that could anchor us to time, history, or culture. For how could we have culture if culture was the transformation of things into objects?" So Indian yellow was a byproduct and driver of such interventions in the life cycles of livestock. Indian yellow was so called by European painters because it was principally made in Bengal. It was harvested by cow herders who collected cow urine and dried it in balls for sale to merchants, who would then ship it to Europe at a hugely inflated price. The high cost of the pigment was, as Jordana Bailkin has demonstrated, due to the fact that the cows used to manufacture the pigment typically died after 2 years and had to be replaced, as restricting their diet exclusively to mango leaves in order to produce this golden urine left them severely malnourished, and also aroused the anger of Hindu cow protection groups in India in the late 19th century. The demand for colour drove the demand for cattle, and this cruel and extreme intervention in the lives of livestock is not an isolated incident. Indeed, in the 1920s, Kodak similarly felt the need to intervene in the feeding habits of cattle after noticing fogging defects in some of their film stocks. This fault was traced back to the diet of the cows, whose skin, bones, and tissue formed the gelatin used to coat Kodak's film. From 1925, Kodak therefore began managing its own livestock in order to better control the diet of its cattle, rearing cows specifically in order to destroy them for manufacturing photographic grade gelatin. And I've just included this slide here of a tweet from the Eastman Museum, named after George Eastman, the founder of Kodak. They did this kind of cute tweet saying, you know, did you know George Eastman named all of his cows? And here's a photograph he took of Sylvia, one of his cows. But of course, as it says here, this is an image, it's gelatin on nitrocellulose. So it's an image of his sort of beloved Sylvia made from the bodies of other cows reared for their photographic gelatin. This entanglement of cattle with the history of colour film is further illustrated by the fact that bovine blood albumin became a substance trialled by the American film company Technicolor, who experimented with the material as a way of purifying their synthetic dyes. If the Anthropocene begins with the Industrial Revolution, with the mass extraction and exploitation of coal, oil, and gas, and the related emissions their combustion releases into the atmosphere, then of course the colour of the Anthropocene is black, a hue associated with smog, pollution, dirt, and grime, not least because by the 19th century, chimney soot itself was a principal colouring element in black pigments, particularly for ink, which required especially powdery, soft substances as its colouring matter. I should note this is part of a longer history in which sort of carbonous substances, so burned animal bones or plant matter, were used for black pigments, but by the 19th century, it's become chimney soot. And soot was ideal for Victorian ink making as a cheap industrial waste material, the byproduct of the many factories belching smoke as they consumed mass quantities of coal to produce steam. And the images that I'm showing you here of Victorian or 19th century ink works. Ink making itself was also a highly polluting practice because the process involved boiling oil, and this was often done in close proximity to large stacks of paper used for printing, so fires were also a constant reality. But blackness is not only the colour of the Anthropocene because of these direct material links to smog and soot, but also because, as both a hue and an artificially constructed racial taxonomy, blackness invites scrutiny of how racial inequality made possible these conditions of industrial expansion, particularly in Britain, where industry, empire, and colonialism were intimately intertwined, a prime example of Cedric J. Robinson's formulation of racial capitalism. The image I show you here highlights how indissoluble these issues of environment, race, and capitalist consumption are. A racist soap advertisement from late Victorian Britain, the image shows a black child washing their skin white with the use of Pears soap, a product that was one of the first industrially produced commodities of Victorian Britain. Its production contingent on oils extracted from colonial territories in West Africa. The subject of this advertisement was a highly conventional theme that appeared in soap advertisements across Europe and America at this time. And I don't want to give this image short shrift here. It's complex and taps into kind of long established, kind of racialized imagery. And I dedicate a whole chapter to this image in my book. So I'd be more than happy to kind of talk about this at length afterwards, and also about the materiality of the print as well. Conflating black skin with dirt and poor hygiene, and white skin with purity and cleanliness, the advertisement's meaning relies upon racist assumptions about the virtues of these skin colours, where blackness is framed as an undesirable layer of grime that should be removed, and whiteness as the appealing, immaculately cleansed surface beneath. But the materiality of the print further lowers the currency of blackness here, as the ink used to represent black skin is itself a form of industrial dirt. It's literally chimney soot suspended in oil. This linkage between black skin, soot, and ink could not have helped dispel the residual ideas from the early part of the century that black skin itself was pigmented by carbonous substances in the blood expelled through the surface of the body. Indeed, as print scholar Jennifer Chong has argued, this conflation of black ink and black skin made the use of black lines to shade white faces in 18th century prints a problematic convention, as the aesthetic and racial purity of the white complexion was perceived to be compromised by this layer of blackness. The use of soot as a black pigment and the use of this pigment for representing black skin highlights what Vergès describes as the connection, in her words, between the Western conception of nature as cheap and the global organization of a cheap, racialized, disposable workforce. This soap advertisement illuminates the close material connection between industrial production and consumption, with its attendant impact on the climate, the extractive economy of empire predicated on racialized hierarchies of power and upon so-called natural resources in the form of biological labor and botanical substances, as well as the systems of representation necessary to shore up these values. the use of black ink pigmented with the waste product of foundries, factories, and refineries in order to represent black skin, itself viewed in the white British imperial imagination as a disposable and devalued substance. But if the Anthropocene is intimately connected with the consumption of coal, then its colour might also be mauve. Mauve is the colour conventionally thought to herald an era of industrially manufactured and chemically synthesised hues. It was accidentally discovered in 1856 by William Henry Perkin, an 18-year-old chemist in London who managed, in an act frequently compared to alchemy, to extract a vivid purple dye from coal tar, a sticky black liquid produced in the manufacture of coal gas, which was one of the major contributors to what geographer Andreas Malm has dubbed the fossil economy. Coal gas was used primarily for lighting, as burning the gas produced a particularly brilliant flame, not to mention noxious vapours. And incidentally, the first uses of this lighting were in mills and factories in order to enable longer working hours. Perkin's discovery that coal tar, this waste product from the gas industry, could yield brilliant chemical hues, not only mauve, but subsequently every colour of the rainbow, was a revelation that transformed the palette of modernity, as the manufacture of dyes was no longer contingent upon expensive, imported organic materials from overseas, like indigo, but could now be executed in Britain locally, cheaply, and at a massive scale. These lurid coal tar colours, or aniline colours, became popular fashion shades in the 1860s, but was subsequently also used to colour film, whether applied by hand or used in tinting processes, as you see here on the left, or used in the industrial dyeing mechanisms employed by Technicolor, which was the company that dominated colour film production in Hollywood between the 30s and the 50s. Both these film colouring processes were contingent on dyeing strips of film using coal tar dyes. And this was because the dye had a particular affinity for animal and plant proteins, so it adhered equally well to cotton, wool, and silk strips of fabric as it did to those gelatin-coated strips of film. Despite the popularity of these coal tar dyes for colouring clothing and cinema, they were known to be harmful to human skin. Erasmus Wilson, Victorian London's leading dermatologist, recounted numerous instances of patients suffering devastating cutaneous afflictions as a result of coal tar colours, recalling one patient whose skin inflamed after wearing socks striped with the purple dye, noting, and I quote, "The impression of the purple stripes was made visible on the legs of the patient in the form of dark red bands that resembled burns." If the rampant fashion craze for mauve in the 1860s was dubbed by the popular press as mauve measles due to the rapidity with which the craze was catching, this was a particularly fitting name for a colour that irritated and corroded skin. Indeed, workers from Technicolor's dye transfer plant in Los Angeles brought a lawsuit against the firm after so many of their workers suffered dermatological problems through handling these toxic materials. But these colours did not just stain and scorch human skin, but also coloured their local environments. The use of coal tar colours for large-scale dyeing operations, whether clothing or cinema, operations that consumed enormous quantities of water, meant that substantial amounts of these polluting substances were released back into water supplies. The Grand Junction Canal that serviced Perkins Dye Works, for instance, was said to change colour on a weekly basis. Indeed, when Technicolor wanted to open a processing laboratory in England, they couldn't use their preferred location in Buckinghamshire because the county council was too anxious about toxic dyes entering the local water system. If the production and consumption of coal was a notorious polluter of the Earth's air and water in the 19th century and a major accelerator of our current climate crisis, then it was not only carbon emissions, but colour that were the byproducts of this industry. If the origin of the Anthropocene is, as a number of scientific bodies and cultural historians have claimed, the dawn of the nuclear age, beginning with the detonation of the atom bomb at the Trinity test in New Mexico in 1945, then the colour of the Anthropocene is pink. The dating of the Anthropocene's origins to 1945 is due not to the fact that nuclear weaponry necessarily triggered or accelerated a change in our climate, but that the fallout from these nuclear explosions left a distinctive trace in the Earth's geological records, a visible distinction in the sedimentary layers of the Earth of the time before and after Trinity. The moment of the bomb's detonation, 5:29, July 16th, 1945, was adopted by the Anthropocene Working Group of the International Commission on Stratigraphy in 2015 as their officially recognised moment that marks the onset of the Anthropocene. As media historian Jennifer Fay has described, this decision meant that, and I quote, "Suddenly geological time as archived in stone is aligned with the microchronology of seconds." It's a neat coincidence for my purposes that the colour film footage of the Trinity tests, which you see here, has now faded to a magenta hue, a fate suffered by colour film stock of this era due to the greater stability of magenta dyes over those less permanent cyan and yellow layers in the stock. And we might think about kind of the stratigraphy of film stock and how this impacts colour as well. But uranium, the crucial component enriched in order to enable this nuclear explosion, has a longer history with colour film, as this metal compound was used in an early film colouring process known as toning, whereby the silver deposits that conventionally comprise the film image are replaced through chemical processing with coloured metal compounds. Uranium could produce a number of hues, most commonly a reddish-brown tint, which here in this sample I'm showing you from a 1927 Kodak manual is treated to a rich, warm pink. I'm afraid to say I know very little about this particular image beyond its inclusion in this technical handbook. I don't know which film it comes from, and I don't know who this actor or extra is. And I want to flag that I'm aware that there's an ethics around speaking about an image like this when I have very little information about the subject. And I've been reading Max Leboir on as a way of kind of helping me think through the ethics of this kind of image. But we can make some educated guesses that this still is in all likelihood from a Hollywood Western, as this would have been one of the few places where Indigenous Americans appeared in the US film industry at this time. And I was particularly drawn to this image as a sample selected to demonstrate uranium toning, because it draws attention to how the atomic Anthropocene is contingent upon the exploitation of Indigenous lands across the globe, not just in America, but Canada, Australia, and many Pacific Island states, where mining, testing, and storage of nuclear materials has toxified the environment, displaced inhabitants, attenuated Indigenous claims to sovereignty, and catalyzed long-term health problems for Indigenous peoples. As Winona LaDuke, an Anishinaabe activist from the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota, describes, this systematic use of Indigenous lands for atomic activity operates as a form of what she calls nuclear colonialism, noting that in 1974, even though only half the uranium in North America was located on Indigenous lands, 100% of the uranium extracted by the US government originated on reservations in North America. As historian Kyoko Matsunaga has explored, in this same decade, the National Academy of Science proposed that US territories, which were occupied by a number of Indigenous groups, including the Diné Navajo, the Laguna Pueblo, and Lakota, should be adopted as what were dubbed national sacrifice areas for unrestricted energy resource development, demonstrating once again the disproportionate impact of the nuclear Anthropocene on Indigenous peoples and the lands they live upon. And this is something Anais Maurer and Rebecca Hogue have explored in their account of what they call transnational nuclear imperialism. The detonation of the bomb at the Trinity site in 1945 had devastating effects on the neighbouring Apache community of the Mescalero Reservation, who became perhaps the first to feel the effects of the atomic Anthropocene. The use of uranium here in this Kodak manual, a substance in all likelihood mined on Indigenous land in America, and perhaps even by Indigenous labourers, in order to colour an image of indigeneity, speaks to the absolute imbrication of systems of consumption, whether natural resources or images, and the violent and toxic business of uranium mining, which is rendered beautiful here through its transformation into gorgeously coloured film. If, as media scholar Carly Simmons describes, the Anthropocene operates, and I quote, as an indexical mark on the planet that makes the violence of imperial projects visible, end quote, then these images stained with uranium similarly mark and trace such histories, despite their complicity in its erasure. We might similarly see the uranium works by German artist Sigmar Polke in a related vein, whereby atomic horror is transformed into beauty through colour. These works were made by placing pieces of uranium on unexposed chromogenic photographic paper. The colour comes from the paper, not the uranium, I should note. He began conducting this process, which he executed in a range of hues, not just pink, in 1982, the year after large-scale protests against the Brockdorf nuclear plant in West Germany, and of course 4 years before the Chernobyl disaster in Ukraine. Unlike the typical colour palette of nuclear disasterism, and you might think of something like the very subdued tones of the recent Chernobyl TV series, Polke uses this saturated pink to render alluring, mesmeric, and vivacious the dangerous, intoxicating rays of uranium, a key material of the Anthropocene. Curiously, these images appear as ghostly echoes of the magenta faded footage of those Trinity tests made nearly 50 years previously. And finally, I would suggest the colour of the Anthropocene is blue. I chose blue here after these images surfaced in February of dogs in Russia who were stained blue by synthetic pigments, believed to be Prussian blue, left behind in decommissioned glass factories in Dzержinsk. Prussian blue, or iron ferrocyanide, is a man-made colour produced through chemical manipulation, but exploiting naturally occurring minerals and metals. And here the colour finds its way, unfortunately, back into nature, carried on the fur of these dogs. Like the indigo factory staining the river, the coloured bodies of these dogs demonstrate a feedback loop between non-human environments and human manipulation, whereby extracted natural resources, chemically transformed, seep and leak back into environments from which they did not emerge. I wanted to close on this image as it speaks, as many of the examples I've offered today do, of how colour itself presents a model for decentering the human, because colour stains, creeps and flows between spaces, materials and environments, and importantly between the human and non-human. And there's also a sense in which colour therefore bleeds through time as well as space, reformulating our relationship to temporality. In this photograph, Prussian blue, an invention of 18th century chemistry, exploited by 20th century Soviet industry, and now manifesting on the bodies of animals in the 21st century, demonstrates a reconfiguration of time through colour. Like the Anthropocene, which insistently cemented human and non-human time, leaving a visible trace in the earth, colour too leaves its mark. In smoggy air, speckled with black soot, in rivers and canals dyed indigo and mauve, in dogs coated blue. What I hope to have presented today then is not so much a chronology of colour and the Anthropocene, but what I might call a chromology, linking colour, climate, human and non-human history. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an impressive and wonderful talk, Kirsty. Do we have questions from the floor? Do you want to ask your questions now, or should we go on with our next talks? You can either raise your hand or you can, yeah, Siobhan, perhaps, if you want to start. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for that fascinating presentation. It was so compelling, and I loved how you used these materials to open up these very kind of distinct moments in time, showing the continuity between them. I'm curious about this tension between you know, the kind of desirous nature of these colors, right? They're so beautiful and saturated. And then this tension you allude to with the kind of concept of the Anthropocene as this site of like decay or loss or extinction. I'm thinking the pulque example is so perfect. They're such seductive images. I guess I wonder, do you think that the sort of like the powerful aesthetic dimension plays a political role? Because I know that's a site of a lot of contestation. So I'm just curious as to what you think.
Yeah, thanks. And it is really fraught, and even putting this PowerPoint together where the readings that I was doing were just so depressing and devastating and just made me want to crawl under a duvet. But then looking at the images, they're so beautiful. And I think you're right that there is a politics to that, you know, we might think of it as an aestheticizing as a way of coping. But also I think you're right that there's a way of kind of masking or rendering beautiful and like further commodifying these processes. So the Hagen photo that I showed earlier, he's this very popular photographer who sells these prints that are about environmental devastation, but kind of look like color field paintings. And I think you're right that the kind of the beautiful imaging of kind of environmental devastation just kind of further feeds back into that loop in a problematic way completely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated thing, but I mean, as an art historian, right, I'm also, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, but I'm also very invested in thinking that there might be something kind of political in beauty, but it's, yeah, I guess, I mean, you do such beautiful work of teasing out like where those things come together and where they might split. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, your comment makes me think about this New York Times cover that came out last September after the California fires. And it looked like a Rothko color-field painting, you know, and everyone was infuriated on social media. It's not a Rothko, you know, it shouldn't look like one. But what if, you know, beauty can also help us become conscious of these issues. I mean, Turner's paintings that picture steamboats and trains with the black smoke, you know, coming out of the chimney, help us perhaps think about these issues.
Yeah, and this is something that I was very aware of writing the book as well, because it is very much, you know, I describe it as messy materiality, and it really is, these processes are kind of dirty and toxic, and a lot of the images of the actual labor that goes into making, especially Technicolor film, like I'm always interested in images of the Technicolor lab, which is actually this really grotty industrial space, but they produce these beautiful films. And that even in doing the scholarship, you know, I think I can't just include all these ugly images in my book. I need to, you know, I'm writing about color. It should be beautiful, right? But that kind of, that aestheticizing impulse kind of masks this other history, which is important to tell. And there's also, you know, there's a great history of Technicolor industrial films as well. They have this fabulous 1940s film called This Is Color that's all about kind of the history of color's relationship to coal. But of course, it's, you know, beautiful dyes swirling around in tanks and made to look like jewels, that there's definitely a kind of an industrial sleight of hand there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it sort of spurred me to thinking about that tension between what's like not just beautiful, but ugly, but also clean and unclean. So something really rich in that sort of conversation that's happening about thinking about the political. So how do we engage images that are participating in those conversations of cleanliness and uncleanliness, beauty and ugliness? And so how do we take up the images that call attention to the politics of that conversation itself? So it reminded me of that phrase ruin porn, and sort of the taking up of these kind of apocalyptic aesthetic qualities that have become so pervasive in our moment and are characteristic of the Anthropocene. And so it really sort of raises the stakes, I think. And I think you did a really beautiful job, Kirsty, of thinking through that complexity in its historical specificity. And I just really loved and enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, thanks so much. And I think you're right as well. This idea of kind of cleanliness as well when coloring. Even the vocabulary we have for coloring things, like staining, right? The process of coloring a surface is to kind of dirty it, but in some ways also beautify it, right? Yeah. So that I've made a note of rune porn as well. Thank you very much.
Do we have other questions?
Yeah. What about green, if I may ask? Especially sort of thinking about cinema and television and things like that. Can the color of Anthropocene be green as well?
Yeah, and definitely if I'd had more time. I thought it's a really obvious one to leave out. I thought about this because it's a color that's become so synonymous with the environment and ecological movements. Even though, you know, ironically, the histories of green, it's a notoriously unstable pigment. It's often one that there aren't recipes for with kind of as long histories. Like ink makers often struggle with green. It has this kind of interesting material history that gets connected in with arsenic in the 19th century. There's a lot of work done on kind of arsenic green and fashion and how toxic that color is. So it is, I haven't done the work to understand when it becomes imbricated with environmentalism, when sort of green comes to mean kind of ecologically sound, because certainly in the 19th century, it was a highly toxic color. So it would be interesting, and I'd like to think more about that. That sort of historical moment when its meaning shifts or becomes kind of associated with environmentalism.
I sorry, just wanted to say, if I may, I think just to go back for a minute on what we said about this kind of the you know, the slight murkiness of potential murkiness of aesthetics as a value, and I was thinking of the connection between that and kind of I think something else that might be considered as something of value, sort of per se, in a human context, which would be humor. I don't know about you, but I have this horrible reflex, just looking at that picture of the blue dog, you know, just makes me smile, which is awful, of course. You know, and I have this kind of double take moment of just thinking, oh my God, you know, that's, you know, you keep torturing yourself thinking about those things, but then you look at them and they just make me, you know, they make you laugh a little bit, which is, you know, anyway, I was thinking of the connection between that, the idea of those kind of those values, and like the how difficult it is for us to sort of just push them aside or sort of try and step outside of those. And I was connecting that with something we've been saying sort of in earlier stages of this project, which is our difficulty to sort of get out of these anthropocentric sort of ideas and feelings and responses, and just trying to sort of take that that further or wider view. And I think we sort of we thought of that in terms of empathy when it came to sort of looking at you know, human looking or non-human looking robots, and that was something we sort of said, well, you know, there's something about anthropomorphism that's, we think of it as bad, but then again, it is a sort of means to an end, you know, because then you do relate ethically. It's terrible that we need anthropomorphism to relate to robots ethically, but then maybe it is something we should use. And I was wondering whether that might be one way to think of aesthetics or humor as something that's kind of troubling, but sort of might be a sort of humble reminder that we are human, and that it's hard for us to, you know, take the right view right away, and we need something that will catch our attention and sort of raise our awareness. And maybe we do need to sort of start by smiling, or maybe I'm just excusing myself, but anyway, maybe there's something there of just yeah, sort of using those things, not thinking of those things as, of those values as the end point, but thinking of those as means for us as human beings to sort of start thinking about our own impact. And
No, I completely agree of the challenge of the impossibility of stepping outside your own subject position as an embodied person, right? And to think about, you know, and I was trying to think about genuinely what would a history of color look like that wasn't coupled with the history of human beings, and how radically different that would look, but also how difficult that would be to historicize as a human being, right? And how to give that stakes that aren't human, if that, yeah, also makes sense. And the question of kind of how to use kind of anthropomorphism or non-human vision it's a really interesting one. I'm hoping this will be a conversation that carries on across the other events as well, and that we could think a bit more about, because it's really interesting. I'd say highly problematic, particularly thinking about things like drones and like aerial vision and capturing images that are impossible to see from the human eye, and but that also being a tool for empathy as well it's really politically fraught, but yeah, really worth raising. Thank you.
Do we have other questions? Okay, I think I have one. You talked about the infection of purple dye and the dermatological problems that people had because of this dye, and I was wondering if this is something that you talk about in your project, in your book, because obviously we're talking about the decentering of human beings, and here it's a little bit as if these dyes, or you could think about glazes also in ceramics, they kind of change the perhaps not the DNA, but you know, yeah, actually perhaps the DNA of your body, you know. And I was wondering if this was something that you explored in your work.
Yeah.
I mean, it's epigenetics, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's I sort of think about the links between color and dermatology largely, not, you know, funnily enough, in the section that thinks about aniline dyes, but in my section I have a chapter on chromolithography, so thinking about sort of the surfaces, like a printing matrix as a skin, and lithography is it's a porous surface that operates very much similarly to human skin, that you coat with oil and grease in order to make. And so I'm thinking about these kind of links between color and human skin, and obviously the racial implications of that there, but yeah, absolutely, kind of thinking about how color as a sort of a surface that kind of interacts with these other surfaces as well, and the skin being one of them. It's also kind of, it's maybe ironic that coal tar is also used for medicinal purposes as well. Like I just discovered that my partner has coal tar shampoo in the in the shower, right? So it like also has these kind of beneficial potentials as well. And interestingly, a lot of colors do. I think Prussian blue also has medicinal uses, and we could certainly think about this as kind of the flip side to this kind of toxicity of color. There's things like these days chroma yoga, right? I don't know if you've seen this, of like exposing your skin to these colored lights as a way of kind of shifting your mood. That there's a sort of counter history to that as well, of the kind of the therapeutic potential of color that balances, well, maybe not balances, but is sort of the other side of this kind of toxicity.
Thanks. Great. Okay. Do we have, we can hear one last question, but if no one has a question, we can move on to our next talk. And at the end, we can obviously come back to your paper, Kirsty. That was brilliant. Malin, do you want to share your screen? Oh, first, yeah. You'll share your screen and I'm going to introduce you.
Oh, okay.
So Malin Palani teaches courses in theatre and performance theory, history and practice. Malin's scholarship focuses on the aesthetics and politics of non-human death and survival within spectacles of climate disaster. Her recent publication include the article, My Sweet Disposability, Oh Bury the Living, and Unearth the Dead, a postcard from nowhere, in the journal Performance Research. and the chapter Performing Death Care, Ignorance, Intimacy and Mourning in Iowa Hug Confinement, from the edited volume, The Aesthetics of Necropolitics. Malin is also a theatre and performance creator, directing productions such as Heiner Müller's Die Hamlet Machine, directing and devising That Wilderness of Glass, What Others Saw Resembles Nothing That Is Ours, and performing a 24-hour nature walk and artist residency with the Hartman Nature Reserve in Iowa. So, Malin, whenever you want, you can start.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. I just want to say that I have a dog that's snoring right beside me. So if that I don't know if the speaker will pick it up, but if it does, don't hesitate to let me know and I can do something about it. Okay, so thank you so much, Sarah and Diane and Estelle, for all of your organizing work and labor that you've put into making this event happen. I am so deeply grateful, and to the institutions that support the work that all three of you do. And also, it's such a great pleasure to be here talking with Kirsty and Siobhan today. I have already very much enjoyed Kirsty's paper, and also I'm looking forward to Siobhan's coming very soon. So my presentation today, as Sarah had said, is on underwater objects. And this is very much a work in progress. It's certainly not a book project, at least not at this point, maybe sometime in the far future. So it's going to have a little bit more of, I think, a questioning kind of platform, and a pathway opening kind of platform. So with that, I wanted to begin with saying that it was almost a year ago today, or this month, that Arundhati Roy wrote her essay, The Pandemic is a Portal. In the essay, Roy suggests that the pandemic is a gateway between one world and the next, a passage in which to create the world anew. Artists have long engaged in creating new and often human-centric worlds. However, as Isabel Stengers writes, quote, "Those of us who are told stories since birth that there is something really special in being human are at a bifurcation point. Either we furiously keep to that narrative, or we accept that if there is a post-Anthropocene worth living in, those who will live in it will need different stories with no entity at the center of the stage," end quote. Decentering the human has gained import through new intersections of the humanities and the sciences, and in the midst of the many crises that we face, including rising sea levels, biodiversity loss, the spread of disease, and mass extinction. I take up Jason DeCaire-Taylor's underwater museums and the caddisfly sculptures of Hubert Duprat in order to rethink practices of ecological collaboration in these times of crisis. I begin with a brief description of each of the artworks, and then I'll get into a little bit more detail after that. In the early 1980s, French artist Hubert Duprat began creating tiny jeweled sculptures in collaboration with caddisfly larvae. Most case-making caddisflies build their cases underwater using silk secreted from their salivary glands in combination with bits of sand, twigs, rocks, and other debris found in the water. Duprat collects the larvae, carefully removes their cases in his studio, and provides them with bits of gold and precious gems to build a new case. In like manner, the underwater museums of British artist Jason DeCaire-Taylor also blur the boundaries between sculpture and art, or sculpture and body, art and nature, architecture and living organism. DeCaire-Taylor site-specific installations, many of which operate as artificial reefs, live along multiple continents and include sites in Grenada, the UK, and the Bahamas. DeCaire-Taylor describes the museums as places of preservation, conservation, and education on marine ecologies. Even though Decatur-Taylor photographs the sculptures, many of these you'll see today, they are meant to be experienced immersively as a participant submerged in a tidal marine ecosystem. Sculptures like The Silent Evolution depicts humans standing in graceful yet eerie stillness, immersed in water, looking toward the sky or gazing down at the ocean bed. The sculptural objects in both projects foreground the relational perspective of art making, challenging the traditional configuration of the artist as a human actor who shapes passive, inanimate materials into finished products. The objects and animals or insects are not merely a backdrop or prop for human manipulation. Rather, the mode of thinking with non-human creators decenters the human artist and implies implicated relationality and processes of care. Brian Masumi describes relationality as an unspecified intensity of total experience that occurs in embodied activity in the midst of already ongoing participation. Relationality is therefore a shared realm from which entities emerge rather than existing as entities prior to interrelating as already constituted. Art that focuses on relational encounter reforges and revitalizes a practice of not only transforming normalized species and subject-object hierarchies, but also prioritizes ethically living within many worlds that precede and exceed the human. Relational approaches do not absolve humans of responsibilities concerning our practices with others, but rather intensifies them. Relationality is not devoid of the operations of and contradictions in power formations, which can be located in the difference between Duprat's removal of the caddisflies from their habitat and providing an entirely different habitat in a tank within his studio, and Decatur-Taylor's sculptures that create the conditions for a habitat to form embedded in a marine ecosystem. Therefore, the collaborative processes that shape relational art are unique to each collaboration. The collaboration between the caddisfly larvae and Duprat raise many questions, including where does the artifice of the sculpture end and the natural life of the caddisfly begin? How might the larval body maneuver and handle objects? How do diamonds, opals, and sapphires come to be arranged in particular ways? What of the textures, shapes, and sizes of these tiny objects attract a larva's attention? What care do the larvae take in handling objects and in building their bodily encasements? Objects emerge and negotiate with a larva in a depth of sensuous expressivity. As Tim Ingold suggests, objects are active constituents in a world in formation. The objects that comprise the caddisfly sculptures are not just objectively determined or subjectively imagined, but practically experienced in the labors that the larvae practice. Their histories, which are embedded in human structures of value, concerning so-called precious gems and metals, also place a demand on thought that reveals contradictions and conflicts in the ordering of nature as resource or nature as spatial practice. In contrast to understanding objects as either animated, often by a human actor, or inanimate, relational thinking considers objects as immersed in the flows of all materials. In Decatur-Taylor's Anthropocene, the Volkswagen doubles as a critique on human fossil fuel consumption and critical living space for lobsters and other crustaceans. The work of the caddisfly objects or the algae on sculptures or of the human artists themselves is not primarily to manipulate materials, but to listen within the flows of matter in a process of attending to the encounter. The architect Alberto Altez Arlandis asserts that an ethics of encounter is a passion for reality, in which, quote, the ethical demand raised is precisely to stick to the encounter, to care about the meeting, to endure, end quote. A creative practice that emphasizes durational encounter also attends to multiple worlds and the objects and subjects within them as always already in the midst of occurring. Therefore, the objects that comprise the sculpture are continually made and remade and participate in the processes of making and remaking. The performance of care with an object might be thought of as a practice that maintains the collaborative processes that hold us together with an ethics of bodily contact that gives attention to contradictions and the unknown involvements in which everything is immersed. Whether artworks foreground the entanglements of encounter in making with, or prioritize the authority of the artist, how we hold each other matters. How one holds others is a question of power, of history, of bodies, of what one does with time and attention in the formation of ecological collectivities that realize the interdependence of all things. Handling, touching, and holding objects, animals, and insects compels a tactile labor that has the potential to be infused with intimacy and inquiry towards the unknown. The process of sensing an object's qualities as histories might produce new bodies and new ecological and political relationalities. Inquiry rooted in handling and sensing others while decentering the human urges no attempt to determine or dominate, but rather to participate in and make manifest the transformations, conflicts, fissures and fractures, coagulations and contradictions of many that easily exceed the context and questions of the human artist as author. When we seek to understand what it means to care through the various and ongoing conditions of collapse, the historical tensions between holding as a practice of intimacy and touch, or as a practice of domination and control, is of consequence. Care for the encounter endures in practices that implacably give attention to the lives, histories, and affective transformations that come to be carried in one's hands, in one's life, and one's histories. The larval sculptures and the sculpted coral reefs reveal a capacity to touch and to be touched in the most subtle, most striking, and the most unspeakable ways. The artworks as exemplified here in The Rising Tide enact a sustained durational encounter in which the human artist refuses to see themselves as separate from others through extended historical and geological time and space. The conventional parameters of an artwork as contained by a beginning and an end are undermined. Instead, the encounter occurs through an intensive and qualitative experience of duration beyond the normative amount of time in which finishing a sculpture might occur, thereby disrupting the centrality of decay as the focus of the artwork. Instead, the artwork becomes an encounter as a practice of coexistence and critique. And you'll notice here that the horses, their heads have been replaced with the structure of an oil pump. So that's part of the critique, as well as the rising waterline that's in this particular sculpture. Staying with the encounter as a process of making with others reinforces a critical ecological approach that is much more excessive and radically inclusive, laboring to make each other matter in uncomfortable confrontations with reality. In the midst of remediation, the installation becomes a carnal ground that makes itself our tomb. The Underwater Museum suggests a critique of human-centered sociality through the spectral constellations that resonate with apocalyptic images seen in US cinema. Inertia features a submerged shirtless man with a half-eaten hamburger watching television, rendering capitalist modernity's apathy towards global warming historically situated within the ongoing present. The unhomely image of white, Western, capitalist, ordinary humanity submerged under ocean waters not only elicits anxieties over rising sea levels and extreme weather, but also has the potential to provoke a new consciousness of the conditions and habits in which these apocalyptic stories are embedded. The marine life that makes its home of and reclaims the statues over time into a museum for the detritus of human, transforms them over time into a museum for the detritus of human civilization. The museum itself becomes an uncanny home, an object of vast and intimate temporal spatial scales that disrupt politics, which, as Rancière suggests, revolves around the properties of spaces and the possibilities of time. The objects generate shadows in reality, shifts in perception, and illusions of scale that vitalize a sense of ruins that evoke the unrepresentable in presentation through their profoundly withdrawn and historically submerged realities. Ghostly topographies warp sensations of time and space with an affective intensity that arouses a sense of unmooring, lessening, slowing, lingering, and deadening. Submerged underwater, the body and its pathways of sensibility and perception necessarily transform. In Vibrant Matter, Jane Bennett asserts that a person's perceptual style makes the border between the animate and the inanimate permeable. However, the distinctions between the animate and the inanimate recenters human perceptions and ontology as that which determines how objects participate in their surroundings. By contrast, Tim Ingold argues that materials such as a table, picture, or a stone in unstill life emerge through processes of historical ecological involvement, not just according to human-centric structures. Entire worlds are closed to our awareness, and the normality of our sense perception deceives. The hidden quality of reality poses a problem to our ways of knowing and opens reality to aesthetics and the work of the imagination in shaping how we encounter objects, whether located in a museum or an artist's studio. Objects disturb how the human sense of perception is organized. The effacement between imagination and reality produces an intensified encounter underwater, in which discarded objects inexhaustibly mediate life and death. Muting, slowing, suspending the sense of sight, sound, light, and linear historical time creates the contours of a constellation that is not limited to the architectures of the sculptures and their placement on the ocean bed. Rather, the coincidence of movement and stillness has the power to draw the listening modality of the entire body into expanded historical and ecological consciousness in the absences and presences of objects, animals, insects, and others in a fragile and temporal home. Decatur Taylor's underwater museums are built in locations that are carefully chosen in consideration of maximizing positive environmental impacts. The artworks are installed downstream of healthy reefs and with attention to the time of spawning so that coral larvae can more easily collect and generate new growth and healthy marine habitats. Sculptures are made from marine grade cement and formed with textures that assist in larval attachments and with shapes that provide safe havens for fish and other marine life. Algae takes hold of statues, helping protect coral from bleaching. Still, these underwater museums face the same threats of ongoing ocean warming, acidification, and the damaging effects of tourism. Also rooted in visions of care and safety, the caddisfly larvae homes are built by and just for their bodies. The object case exactly holds each larval body and in many cases grows with the growth of the larva. The body pressing against the limits of the objects that it touches and that touch it. Objects pressed to body, body pressed to bits of gold and diamonds. Where does the diamond end and the heart begin? The sheath of jewels and gold adapts to the larval body and is the ultimate object for protection. Here, the work of the larva with the objects is bound with the finest filament of care for the emergence of life. The objects grow with the oscillating pressures of inside and outside, hidden and emergent. The sympathy of form between the substituted metals and jewels and the sand and twigs reveal a similar protective function between what would otherwise have been considered disparate objects. After the pupa stage of several weeks or months is complete, the mass emergence of caddisflies occurs. Caddisfly cases multiply images of transformation and emergence and suggest daydreams of mixed creatures. The pupating larvae that inhabit these hiding spaces embed in our dreaming imaginations that desire intimacy with things. They evoke the tiny worlds that capture us as children when we perform magical operations on ourselves to live in proximity with collections of found objects. The hollow caddisfly casket participates in practices of dreaming renewal, drawing together the ending of the larval form and the beginning of the aerial life, the conjunction of water and air. Submerged objects and museums of remnant and renewal rupture the ideological surface of our epoch, exposing our values and power formations, and encourages us to open to that which we do not fully understand or perceive with a sense of generosity and humility that is less concerned with defining what we do to others as separate from us and more concerned with living an ethical and critically thought life through practice with others. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malin, for this glorious talk and beautiful images, paradoxically comforting, perhaps, because, you know, the underwater atmosphere is a sublimating, you know, environment. We're gonna move on to Siobhan, to Siobhan's talk, and then we'll listen to the questions. So Siobhan, you can share your screen and I'm going to introduce you. Dr. Siobhan Angus is a Benting postdoctoral fellow in the history of art at Yale University, where her research explores photography, materiality, and perceptions of nature in the context of resource extraction. She holds a PhD in art history and visual culture from York University, where her dissertation was awarded the Governor General's Gold Medal. Her research has been published in Panorama, Journal of the Association of Historians of American Art, Radical History Review, and the edited collection Capitalism and the Camera, published by Verso. She's a co-editor of The Goose, a journal of arts, literature, culture, and a board member of the Workers' Arts and Heritage Center. Siobhan, whenever you want.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for coming today, especially Kirsty and Malin for those incredibly generative conversations. And I think there's some really productive points of overlap. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. So my presentation today centers on a very simple and somewhat obvious premise, that the mind is a necessary precondition for photography as a medium. Since its inception, photography, both analog and digital, has relied on large and small-scale extraction. So today, I want to meditate on the implications of this reality by looking at photographs made with fossil fuels, with bitumen. And photography deals with the world of the surface, but materially, it's rooted in subterranean depths and deep time. And in the particular case of bitumen, by extension, petrocapitalism. So I want to redirect our awareness to bitumen deposits that lay below the surface of the earth as a way of enacting a reorientation of vision. In the process, I suggest that this might do some work to destabilize and defamiliarize one way of seeing the world, an imaginary that is currently bounded by petrocapitalism. So consider a delicate golden-hued photograph that shimmers as it catches the light. The photograph, syncrude plant and tailings pond reflection, captures the infrastructure of a bitumen mine in the Athabasca tar sands of Western Canada. So oil extraction is the subject of the image, but bitumen, an unrefined form of petroleum, is also the material that's used to make the photograph. The bitumen is fixed on the surface of a polished metal plate where it registers an indexical trace of extraction. The opacity and texture of the hardened bitumen forms a striking contrast to the smooth surface of polished aluminum. So Warren Cariou, a photographer, filmmaker, and academic of Métis and European descent, replicates Nicephorniskep's labor-intensive early photographic process, heliography, to produce photographs made with oil from the Athabasca tar sands. And Cariou's emplaced photographs reflect his personal connection to this territory. He's from Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, which is located near the Athabasca River and the infrastructure of the tar sands. So in essence, Cariou deploys bitumen to capture the extraction of bitumen, introducing questions of process, labor, and material. The tar sands are located on Indigenous territory subject to Treaty 8, which was signed in 1899 and 1900 between the Canadian state and Cree, Dene, and Métis nations of the Athabasca region. The largest industrial project in the world, the tar sands are the third largest proven oil reserve with an estimated 1.84 trillion barrels of crude bitumen. The tar-like bitumen is mixed with sand and it's very difficult to extract, which makes the tar sands one of the most ecologically destructive industrial sites in the world. If Canada is going to reach its commitments to the Paris Agreement, scientists have shown that the majority of this bitumen has to stay in the ground. Resistance to extraction by Indigenous land and water protectors, as well as environmentalists, have made this landscape a space of contestation between Indigenous communities, petrochemical companies, and the state. So this particular oil sits at the intersection of climate change, colonialism, and extractive capitalism. And within the image, the infrastructure of the tar sands comes into view. So the visual signifier of the smokestack marks the scene as industrial. The title tells us that the water in the foreground is a tailings pond, a man-made lake managed by dams and dikes that holds the byproducts of extraction. In the monochrome photograph, however, the toxic slurry, a mixture of salts, residual bitumen, chemical compounds, including acids, benzene, hydrocarbons, silt, and clay, is neutralized into a general impression of water, albeit a very unnatural one. The formal symmetry between the top and bottom half of the image is disrupted as the image is set on a polished aluminum plate, which is a highly reflective surface. So from some angles, the evanescent image functions as a mirror, which superimposes the human body into the landscape, destabilizing the boundary between the inside and the outside of the frame. So in viewing, the viewer becomes immersed within this petroleum-coated landscape upon which they have a visible effect. And Cariou's photographs are striking Because narratives of mechanical reproduction, or in our current moment, even something like demateriality, typically define our understanding of photography. I suggest that these image objects and the very tangible materiality introduced through the use of bitumen introduce a very clear political critique of the human and environmental consequences of extraction in the tar sands. So in contrast to some strands of materialism that evade the political questions raised by materials and infrastructure, these objects invite us to think politically about materiality, about how these materials are extracted, about the relationships that structure this, and the impacts that this has on the environment. So Cariou makes this connection between extraction and representation tangible, and in doing so, asks what it means to see through oil. So bitumen was used as the light-sensitive material that produced the earliest known camera photograph. So Nicep's view from the window at Le Gras from 1826 or 1827 is a photo-engraved bitumen image set on a pewter plate. He called his process the heliograph, sun writing, centering the role of light. In renaming the heliograph the petrograph, oil writing, Cariou shifts attention from the role of light to the role of the fossil fuel. So by repurposing bitumen, there's a different relationship that's established with the material that considers the damaging, but also the desirous nature of oil. And petroleum is a very broad category of fossil fuel that encompasses crude oil and bitumen, which is a semi-solid tar-like substance. Experiments on the effect of light on bitumen date back to 1798, and it was first used by Nicep as a photographic agent in 1814. He lived near mining regions in Northeast France, where both solid and liquid bitumen were readily available. But one of the challenges posed by using bitumen in a photographic process is its very unstable materiality. Photographers complained about the most contradictory results documented by people working with this very variable substance. The chemical properties and light sensitivity of bitumen samples varied considerably, which posed significant problems to the attempt to standardize the process. As a contemporary complained, it is impossible to lay down fixed rules for exposure or working, and the only way of ascertaining the photographic properties of any particular specimen is by actual trial. So acquiring bitumen specifically for photography was therefore complicated by the considerable variation in its material composition. The Photographic News analyzed photochemical properties of different natural asphalts, concluding that bitumen from Judea and from Trinidad was the most suitable for photography. At this point in time, the Athabasca tar sands had not yet been discovered, but the tar there is thicker and in some cases is actually classified as an ore, which makes it solid. And so this material requires a much longer exposure time, complicating the process. So bitumen-based processes never really took off, and a bitumen photograph might be something like a novelty. But once oil is refined, it is omnipresent in our lives. Oil is deeply enmeshed in artistic culture. As Ross Barrett and Daniel Warden observe, petroleum products are used to make film, ink, paint, and countless other tools used to produce art, while the wealth produced by the extraction of oil is an underwriter of nearly every major museum. But despite this, as Amtav Ghosh has observed, fossil fuels are largely absent in culture, despite their political and economic centrality. As the editors of the Petroculture's anthology ask, the 20th century was transformed by oil. Why then has it taken until the 21st for us to begin to grapple with the cultural and social consequences of this transformation and the substance that made it happen? So in this context, the insistence on materializing oil invites us to contemplate how it underpins our world. As an unrefined material, bitumen is often concealed. It rarely enters into vision. It's extracted from remote mining sites, transported in pipelines that snake through landscapes, and refined into crude oil. This infographic shows how oil is all around us, in textiles, cosmetics, heart valves, paint, tires, food preservatives, vegan leather, computer, televisions, and of course, cameras. So all of these objects are featured in advertisements, but advertisements never show us the oil itself. The Talented artist Semi Angares project Black Gold breaks from this to literally put bitumen on display. So in a backlit photograph, the shimmering blackness of a bituminous rock is presented on this velvety black backdrop. The photograph evokes luxury advertising, and it draws attention to the seductive, charismatic nature of bitumen. And framed in a light box, it's quite literally put on display, marking a striking break from the invisibility of petroleum in culture. But I want to return to Cariou's practice to consider how his petrographs might reveal a post-extractive imaginary, something beyond our current over-reliance on petroleum and the prioritization of extraction over ecosystems and human health. So in doing so, I turn to Métis anthropologist Zoe Todd, who writes about fossil as kin. Todd reminds us that fossil fuels are the remains of ancient life. In extractive capitalism, oil becomes weaponized as a pollutant, and the burning of oil weaponizes these fossil kin, these long dead beings, and transforms them into threats to our existence as humans. So by reframing fossil as kin, Todd asks us what responsibilities we might have to fossil fuels, in addition to the other human and extra-human species that make up the Athabasca region. So this is a complicated and unresolved question, but Todd highlights that the oil itself isn't the problem. It's the large-scale extraction of petroleum for profit that's damaging. So I want to consider another photograph by Cariou titled Prayer Tree. So a tree trunk is wrapped in cloth, which is done in Cree and Anishinaabeg territories as a way of honoring the tree and marking the site as a space of ceremony and contemplation. So the cloth is an offering to the tree and to the earth. So rather than showing us the destruction caused by extraction in the tar sands, Cariou diverts a small amount of bitumen out of the energy industry and into a medium of representation to show us a parallel history of the tar sands. So this is also a mirror. So Cariou immerses the viewer in this landscape scene, a reminder that the tar sands is also a sacred place, a boreal landscape of waters more than human species, and the traditional territory of the Métis, Dene, and Cree people. The prayer tree forms a contrast to the extractive practice of marking and wrapping trees, as trees are also wrapped in forest management projects, using paint or colored ribbon to indicate which trees should be removed or preserved in logging. Logging exists alongside oil extraction in the tar sands, as industrial production requires the damming of rivers, the clear-cutting of forests, and the removing of overburden. In fact, the tar sands are being deforested at a rate that lies only behind the Amazon rainforest basin. As Potomac scholar Kyle White observes, industrial settler campaigns erase what makes a place ecologically unique in terms of human and non-human relations, the ecological history of the place, and the sharing of environment by different human societies. And so popular imaginaries of the tar sands are of a landscape that has been reshaped by destructive industrial processes. So the Athabasca region becomes framed as a destroyed landscape, as oil becomes weaponized as a pollutant. But by working with a material that's considered damaging and is actually quite toxic to work with, Cariou repurposes bitumen as a way of showing the other histories, the other stories, and the other purposes of this extractive zone where this material originates from. So in doing so, an instrumental relationship to land that's centered on either the extractive objectification of land, or alternatively, the subjectification of an abstract nature is challenged. By engaging materially with this substance that has come to define the region, the artist proposes a fundamentally different relationship to the material. Cariou reflects on the intimate nature of making petrographs, saying that as I spent more time with the bitumen, I came to understand it not only as a source of potential danger, but also a creative collaborator, helping reveal new ways of seeing the world. So I argue that Cariou's petrographs provide a glimpse into a future where our relations to land have shifted. Nishnabeg writer Leanne Simpson has described the impossibility of colonial capitalism in terms of having the tools to achieve the transitions that we need to avert catastrophe. She argues that, and I quote here, accumulation-based societies don't like the answers we come up with because they are not quick technological fixes and they aren't easy. Real solutions require a rethinking of our global relationship to land, water, and each other. They require critical thinking about our economic and political systems. They require radical systemic change. The radical change Simpson articulates is one of decolonization, a future that includes the rematriation of indigenous lands and waters and the transformations of entire societies, including those that might not be the site of settler colonies, but that benefit nonetheless from the wealth extracted there. And so in contrast to extraction, which sees nature as resources to be accumulated for the production of wealth, Cariou's practice approaches nature as a gift, not a commodity, to borrow Robin Wall Camerer's phrase. And gifts establish relationships. They enter into obligations of reciprocity. And this is a critical part of Cariou's practice, as he doesn't sell his images, he gives them. So Rob Nixon describes extractive capitalism as something that abstracts in order to extract, a process that plays out in visual culture. The doubled indexicality of these images, gathering oil from this territory to document this territory, roots these images in place. So they explicitly foreground the relations of settler colonialism and extractive capitalism that transformed this land into a commodity or a resource. At the same time, the prayer tree refutes the abstraction of this territory. Cariou's practice shows us that bitumen is a material that exists outside of extraction, and this landscape has value besides the wealth that is physically taken out of it. So in doing so, it counters the extractive gaze by showing us other forms of relating to this place that existed before, during, and will exist after extraction in the tar sands. So in doing so, they introduce a more complex understanding of environmental damage and the ongoing possibilities of life in environmental sacrifice zones. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, for another amazing talk. Really, really amazing. Yes. Do we have questions from the floor? Yes, we have one question. Yeah.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Sorry for joining you so late. I was busy during the rest of the day, and thank you very much for your presentation. It's always a pleasure to have people speaking about Métis literature and art. We want to know more about these people and artists, and thank you so much. I had a question regarding the smell of those pictures. Because if, I don't know, do you have one of them? As you said that maybe Warren Cariou gave one of them to you or sent one of them to you. Those are pictures that smell, and they're not inert. They speak to our senses, they speak to the eye, but they also speak to our nose. And so I wanted to know if you had something to say about this, because you didn't speak about the very heady smell that they give off. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful question. So I do have one of the images. I have the image of the prayer tree, and I write with it on my desk every day, and I see my face reflected in oil. But the one that I have is behind glass. And so that kind of, the sensory dimension in that way is removed. But one of the most striking things about bitumen is its smell, right? It's so overwhelming and very disorienting, which also complicates the process of making these photographs. And I think one of the things that is very interesting, I think there's a lot of contemporary artists who are using these analog photography processes. But they're incredibly toxic, right? You have to be very careful about ventilation and materials. And I mean, I think this goes back to the kind of earlier discussion about materials and making, but you realize like the industrial processes of making, and even just individual artists who would be using this, like the kind of occupational disease and that way that materials also interact with our bodies, I think is such an interesting question that we're really forced to confront when we see these very material objects or these very material ways of making.
That is also true for oil paint, actually. Yes, Kirsty.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you both for those phenomenal papers. I was furiously taking notes all the way through. Kind of just following on from that question, it was really a question about kind of conservation and just this question about care that came up. With works that are sort of designed, as you were talking about, Malin, to kind of evolve and change, and then Siobhan, what are the conservation issues around these objects, and is kind of entropy built into their production, and is that in some way a way of resisting the kind of capitalization of these objects? I'd just love to hear more about kind of the issue of conservation and permanence around these objects in particular.
That was also a question that I had for Siobhan, and like in part, not just on conservation, but also in, are these images displayed, and are they, do they have an audience, and how does the audience engage with them? And so I can imagine, of course, seeing these pictures and photographs in sort of the cleanliness of the gallery space, right? Which is so different from often the artist studio, which is, like you mentioned, is sort of filled with these various toxicity, how those are handled in terms of ventilation, or, what kind of containment measures are put into place to kind of handle that toxicity. And so I was wondering, how, I know you have one in your home, but how would an audience engage with them? And how would they, like, I imagine, well, what would a gallery space be where these would be on display, along with sort of like buckets of bitumen or something? And so if or how that sort of toxicity plays with and against the gallery space and the space of display, because it's so different. And of course, if you go to DeCare Taylor's underwater museums, for example, your whole bodily experience is changed necessarily just by entering into that space. And those objects are created with conservation and preservation in mind, and really thinking about the materials themselves as not being toxic, which is not to say that there still isn't a labor that's happening right? Yeah, that's in connection and contact with the materials. But I don't know if you have something to add, Siobhan, about the space of display and engagement.
Yeah, thank you for that series of perfectly paired questions. So I'll talk about display first and then conservation. Yeah, so Warren primarily works as an academic and a filmmaker, and making these petrographs was sort of a way of like thinking through the tar sands as a place. And so they have been displayed in some gallery and museum contexts, but they're very hard to display because they're so sensitive to light, right? I mean, if you go and look at daguerreotypes in museums, it's a similar thing where they're actually not very suitable to a gallery space because of their instability, right? They're always changing. So it can be done, but it's a bit more complicated. But I think that that idea of like, you know, bringing the material into the gallery is also very complicated. There's a brilliant artist, Dana Prieto, who makes ceramics from contaminated soil in Argentina. The soil has been contaminated by mining. And she had considerable issues with the museum show where she wanted to bring in some of this clay as part of the installation. And the conservationists were just like, there is no way that this can come into the gallery space because it's like toxic and it's dust and it's decay, right? And so I think that as artists are really kind of interrogating these questions, they run into these very tangible limits from institutions and spaces themselves, some of which are obviously, of course, important, right? You wouldn't want like damage to happen to other objects or within the space, but it kind of raises some really interesting questions. And the question of conservation is also fascinating. So as I understand, I think that these bitumen photographs are quite stable once they are set. I don't think that bitumen really goes anywhere, but I think it's better to kind of store them away from light, like most things. But this fits into a larger project where I'm looking at different metals and minerals that have been used in photographic processes. And one of the things that's quite fascinating to me is that, you know, obviously most photography is set in silver, analog photography, because it has a very stable materiality. It's incredibly light sensitive. You can take very fast photographs. There's a lot of things about it that make it much more suitable. But one of the challenges posed by silver is that while silver is materially stable, it's incredibly reactive to sulfur. So in the 19th century, when people were making these photographs and there was a lot of air pollution in cities like London from burning coal, silver photographs were more damaged than other materials. So I'm kind of interested in the rise of iron-based processes like platinum, which are much more stable, right? Like a platinum print will last forever. Whereas all of these 19th century silver prints, you know, you can really see these material traces of decay. And that's where, again, I think these kind of fascinating questions of specificity, I think tell you something a little bit different about how art objects kind of interact with environments at the same time as they document them.
Thank you. That's really interesting. It makes me think about Whistler's painting, Nocturne in Black and Gold, that I think also, whose texture was also modified by atmospheric pollution. And I think Jesse Oak Taylor is working on that and is going to, I heard him speaking about his research on this. So, that's something to look forward to. That's really interesting. And Siobhan, I was really fascinated by this idea of the double indexicality of bitumen in these photographs. And it made me think about the fact that in them, bitumen is at the same time the signified and the signifier. And I was wondering if you were thinking about form through perhaps more literary, or through the prism of more literary approaches, you know, how I don't know if it's something that speaks to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a fascinating question. And I would love to kind of follow up with maybe some suggestions for reading. But one of the things that was so striking about this particular way of making is that, you know, we often think about photographs as being fundamentally disconnected from the source, right? And so much photo theory, I feel like, doesn't quite get at the sort of strange site specificity of these particular photographs. So even as they move later, there's something about them that is so rooted in place that I think is pretty fascinating. And I think it's something that, you know, I'm kind of trying to explore further. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, just perhaps to give you a hint, what I was thinking of was Derrida's notion of the supplement, you know, that is neither signified nor a signifier, but because what we see when we see the supplement is both, you know, is an experience of both. So that's, I mean, that's something that I'm also thinking about in my research. And obviously,
Derrida also has some theorization around the frame and sort of that oscillation between inside and outside that I think might be helpful as well to think about the photograph and the image, for sure.
Do we have more questions? We only have 5 minutes left. Because everyone in France has to go buy a baguette afterwards, you know. We only have 1 hour left. Do we have other questions?
Maybe just a comment. It's just more. It's not really a question, but just visually made me think of etchings. Actually, sort of a little bit beforehand, but in both cases, because also in somehow, I mean, the sculptures in the underwater, they also get sort of kind of attacked progressively, I suppose, by time. So it's just a sort of maybe another sort of layer that can be linked to this discussion somehow, sort of erosion. But and to Kirsty's point about entropy, I suppose.
Yeah, and to pick up on that a little bit, this idea of entropy is not just a sense of like, you know, everything being destroyed, but that there's a sense of life still being created out of it and still happening. So it's again a pairing of what we tend to see as opposites, the living and the dying, but that those things are actually happening, that there's life in decay and there's decay in life. And I think that, you know, that sort of directs our attention towards really looking at the complexity of what's happening with our involvement and embeddedness in materials, and helps us move away from what Siobhan, you know, spoke about in a lovely way, the extractive kind of mode, and thinking about a different kind of political engagement, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I just had a remark really to thank everybody, but this idea came to me earlier as I was training to hear some of Kirsty's paper as students were on a climate march outside my windows, and so I couldn't quite hear what you were saying. And I thought what was really striking about the 3 papers was how your work, and also the work of the artists that you're working on, is really making the Anthropocene like very visible. And I've learned so much thanks to your paper, and thank you very much. And so I find that talking about objects particularly, and materiality and matter, since that's what we're talking about, to tackle the subject of the environment or the Anthropocene is really, really helpful to speak about students and to teach students. And actually, I was thinking about all the things you said to me and how I'm going to probably include some of it in my teaching. So I wanted to thank you for this. And I had a very quick question. As we are teachers, I was wondering about the extent to which talking about the environment or environmental humanities is part or not part of our teaching practices. I know it's very much not the norm in France. I was wondering whether it was a little bit more of a norm where you teach? But that's a very wide question. We've got 1 minute left, so I'm sorry to just like ask this now, but this is what it made me think about anyway. So thank you very much. I don't know if anyone wants to answer, or if we can think about it for next time, but
I would jump in and say at St Andrews, it's very much part of our curriculum that, I teach intro to film, and we have a lecture where I say, like, this is what films are made from. They're made from cows and mines, silver. And we teach an eco cinema module where these subjects are very kind of crucial. But I think it is new, and particularly that material attention to like what film is made from, and that prehistory of photography as well that Siobhan spoke about so eloquently. But yeah, just not to hog the minute. Again.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. Thank you.
For me, I'm not part of an institution, so I can't speak towards a specific institution in particular, but my experience is that this is really not part of the curriculum in the US in general, but that does not negate that it is foundational to my teaching. It is, I work in performance studies and theater studies, and so thinking about the aesthetics of politics and the politics of aesthetics is foundational. I mean, thinking about how bodies move, and bodies are always part of our surroundings. So it's foundational nonetheless.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, I think the conversation is changing very quickly. I'm just designing a class for a material histories of photography course, which, like your course, Kirsty, really deals with the kind of environmental histories of materials, and then also an eco art class. So I think that, as students especially are so interested in these questions, I think as educators, we're catching up to them, right? So it's an exciting time to be teaching.
Thank you so much. Okay, we very much look forward to continuing this conversation with you over the next 2 weeks. So just a small reminder, in case you missed part of today's session or might not be available throughout the series, these sessions are recorded and will be uploaded and available for viewing online. And you can find the links on the web page of our project, Humanities After Humans. I'm going to copy the link, or perhaps Estelle or Diane, you can copy the link in the chat box. Next week, we'll meet at the same time for a session on bodies that matter. So have a great weekend, and thank you so much for these fantastic talks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, and thank you.